you, Congressman Phillips, for joining us today to talk about a number of issues. But of course, let's start by what was on the minds of a lot of Americans this week, and that is the anniversary of January 6th, the so-called insurrection at the nation's capital. You have authored legislation along with at least one of your colleagues. You want to name January 6th Democracy Day. What's that all about?
I do, Tom, because I believe it's important that we Americans recognize how fragile this all is, not just because of January 6th and the insurrection, but because of the divisions in the country, the erosion of faith in our institutions of democracy. And I think it's important that we come together in a civic fashion, Democrats and Republicans, independents and people of all political perspectives, to recognize what's more important than any policy, any politics, is the preservation of the country itself. And January 6th of last year was the first time in 240 years of American history in which Americans stormed their own capital. And I believe it's time for some reflection and some commemoration of the fact that democracy is fragile. We have a responsibility as Americans to invest in it, cultivate it, nurture it together, independent of politics, and that's the rationale.
Now, a lot was made this week of the fact that Republicans, by and large, were fairly silent on this anniversary. But my question is, what do Democrats expect them to do? Clearly, most, if not all, are not going to defend what happened. And I'm guessing a lot of them don't want to draw any more attention to it than was already being drawn.
Of course. I'm disappointed, Tom, to be forthright, in that there wasn't more recognition of what took place. But more important than even January 6th itself is just the fragility of our democracy. And you asked the question of what would I like to see them do? The same thing that we're all supposed to do, which is hold people to account who break the law or risk the integrity of our entire country. It doesn't matter if they're Democrats or Republicans. Principle is principle. Clearly, self-preservation takes precedence over principle in Washington. People want to keep their jobs, and they do what's politically expedient instead of what their principles dictate they should. And I have to say, those who stormed the Capitol last January 6th will be prosecuted. I think 730 charged so far, some being imprisoned. But they were all misled. And I think it's time that we just recognize the reality that these are people who were told a lie by the defeated former president of the United States. They bought into it. They did what they thought they were supposed to do based on his incitement. And the fact of the matter is they'll be going to jail. And we have people walking the halls of Congress and Mar-a-Lago who, in my estimation, are directly responsible for it. And the fact that they have not been held to account is disappointing. And ultimately, it may be the political jury, if you will, we voters around the country that make that decision if courts of law won't. But that's what I would expect, Tom, is to uphold the oath of our office, the rule of law, and hold people accountable when they break the law. That's true whether it's a carjacking, whether it is a riot, whether it is an insurrection, whether it is corruption of any kind in the body politic. That's what we're here to do. And I'm disappointed in my colleagues who refuse to acknowledge it.
Less than a minute to go. One other issue, the Build Back Better bill appears to be all but dead. You agree with that assessment?
Well, right now it's on life support. Let me just say that. And let me also say that there are components of it that if people look at it very objectively, will ultimately invest in our children, reduce costs for families, and reduce crime. Because if we take care of kids at the most precious ages, especially those who are not afforded advantage in the beginning of their lives, if we invest in them with pre-K education, the child tax credit, and child care, we will see a generation rise that will see a reduction in crime, more self-sufficiency, and less burden and loss of life for our entire country. And I hope people take a good objective look at that, not to mention climate change, Tom. There are provisions that we should collectively get behind to save the planet for future generations, plain and simple. That's not politics. That's another perspective of principle.
And finally, just 10 seconds left. You must be amused whenever Washington, D.C. shuts down when there's a risk of a half inch of snow, which happened on Friday.
There's a lot of strange things that I've witnessed in Washington, Tom. Amongst the very strangest is the threat of a half an inch of snow in Washington, D.C. If anybody wants to get a good laugh, we fellow Minnesotans, it's a good way to do it.
All right, Congressman Dean Phillips, thank you so much for joining us today, and best of luck to you in Congress. And we'll be talking to you as the campaign season unfolds here in 2022.
I look forward to it. Thanks, Tom.
Imagine what they'd do if it was 20 below zero.